Dear colleagues, welcome to IPI for this lunchtime discussion on supporting a durable and inclusive peace in Afghanistan, the role of Afghan women. My name is Sarah Taylor. I am a senior fellow here at IPI, and I am the lead on our Women, Peace, and Security work. I'm really, truly delighted to thank our partners on this event, Cordaid, the Georgetown Institute on Women, Peace, and Security, and NYU's Center for Global Affairs, and of course, a very distinguished panel. This event is taking place the day after the UN Security Council's annual open debate on women, peace, and security. And for those of you who were following on Twitter or live in person, the Council has adopted a 10th resolution on women, peace, and security. And it was startling, as it always is, to be in that venue and to hear member states talking about their commitment to this issue, which is often a genuine commitment to this issue, but to be confronted 19 years after the adoption of Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security with the reality, confronted through the stories from Sudan about the work that women have done, putting their bodies on the line to break curfews, to brave tear gas, and to still be excluded from the discussions that determine the future of their communities and their country. To hear about the ongoing situation in the Central African Republic, where women have consistently been excluded from, again, decision-making, despite the fact that sexual violence is a huge part of the way conflict there is being waged, and despite the fact that women are, as everywhere, mobilized for peace and demanding a voice in the future of their country. Which brings us to Afghanistan and today's discussion. I am not going to delve into the details of Afghanistan. That is what the next speaker is going to do to provide framing remarks. I'd like to introduce at this point Rina Amiri, who is the senior fellow at NYU Center for Global Affairs, who's going to give us some context for the rich and deep discussion that we'll be having this afternoon. Rina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you first to IPI for hosting this event and for so many of you who have come here. I know that this is a week with a lot of different activities, so I very much appreciate you being here for this important discussion. And maybe I'll start by talking a little bit from a personal perspective to set the tone. We don't want this to be a talk shop. We want this to be a real exchange. I am originally from Afghanistan, and prior to 2001, as one of my hats, I was an activist on Afghanistan and trying to bring attention to what was going on in Afghanistan and the plight of Afghan women. And it fell on deaf ears until the tragic events of September 11th. And suddenly the world woke up to the plight of Afghan women. And there was this enormous mobilization effort around bringing attention to what the Taliban had done to Afghan women. And it was used as a means of mobilizing support for military activities in Afghanistan, the coalition efforts. And yes, it was the instrumentalization of women. But at the same time, it did create this some enormous windows. At the Bonn process, at every level, there was support for women's participation. All the stakeholders had to involve women, and this was pushed by the member states. It was pushed by the UN. Women were there as official members, as advisors. There was a civil society parallel conference where I think over 40% of the participants were women, and I was a part of that. We had women as observers, and the agreement included specific references to women's inclusion. It was, as we know, a very imperfect agreement, and there were exclusion elements that have led us to where we are today, where once again we're trying to end the war in Afghanistan. But there was a critical inclusion element that opened the doors for women. And women opened the doors for the rest of Afghan society. It was women themselves that ended up using that spacing, using that window and that leverage that the international community provided, and using it strategically to advance women's rights, to create a horizontal movement and a vertical movement. And I think for the first time in Afghan history, you have a women's movement that is across the country in every province. You have women in leadership positions in the government, and it's a special honor to note that the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the UN is a woman, Ambassador Adel Raz. We have the Afghan ambassador to the US, who is a woman. And in this context, so enormous progress achieved, and I was there during the constitutional process when the women mobilized across factions, across ethnicities, and doubled their representation by lobbying and trading across interests and being strategic actors, and making Afghanistan the most, have the highest level of representation in parliament in the region. And yet, we are 18 years later, we're talking about a peace process has been in place for the last year. Now it is stalled, but there was the US-Afghan Taliban talks, which I think many of you are aware of, have moved forward. But with that, there has been a real weariness of the international community with Afghanistan and a real desire to find a way to end this war in a positive way through a political settlement, a peace settlement. But there has been also a regression in terms of where the stance has been on inclusion. Women's rights and inclusion has moved from an absolute priority by the international community to noting it as something that is relegated just to intra-Afghan talks. And while Afghan women will tell you themselves, yes, absolutely, and Afghans in general, yes, absolutely, it should be Afghan-led. But the international community has a role to play. They open a window. Afghanistan is still the international community is really very relevant as political actors, as donors, and the windows that it creates and it closes has an impact. And suddenly the Afghan actors, the political leaders who were lining up and expressing support for women at the table, even if they didn't actually really buy into it, but they did it, some of them maybe disingenuously, but because the international community insisted on it. Now those actors are saying behind closed doors, and quite frankly in front of open doors, that if those rights will ultimately have to be sacrificed. And it is ironic that in the age of where the world has awakened to the Me Too movement, where we have 18 years after the women, peace and security agenda started, and as Sarah said, 11 resolutions later, we are moving away from a country in which women's rights, I think that there's been a recognition that it is the context where women's rights were probably the worst in any part of the world under the Taliban. And so the questions that I think we want to look at today is, what are the arguments that we need to make that we're not making? What is it that we need to do to move from lip service, and in this case, the lip service is even less than it used to be, to genuine commitment? Who needs to make those arguments? And then strategically, what are the ways that we should be thinking about inclusion and process design? What are the best practices? And I hope that it can be a really honest discussion and an open discussion, because what we talk about in this room, we hope to factor into a platform that we are in the midst of putting together to support women in Afghanistan and more broadly, women in peace. And with that, I turn to our distinguished panelists and to Jake, who will be moderating, Jake Sherman. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. You have their full bios, and then we'll quickly get the discussion going. So our first speaker is Starai Tapish. She's the Deputy Director of the Afghan Women's Network based in Afghanistan. Our second panelist is Ambassador Karen Pierce, the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom. And third, Teresa Whitfield, the Director of the Policy and Mediation Division at the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs at the UNDP-PBA. We're going to do 2 rounds of questions and then open things up to the audience. The first set of questions that I'm going to ask the panelists is going to focus on why women are important to durable peace in Afghanistan and indeed to political processes beyond the Afghanistan context. And then the second set of questions is going to focus on how we make that happen. So to start, Sarai, if I could ask you, there's been quite a lot of recent coverage in the news about the peace efforts in Afghanistan, which Rena alluded to, and of course, not much focus on the role of women and on their rights, in part because that level of participation has in fact been insufficient. So could you share your assessment of women's efforts in the peace process in Afghanistan and their engagement in, or in fact absence from, that process and those efforts? Thanks.
Yes, well, thank you, Sherman, from your question. Before I answer this question, I would like to thank the International Peace Institute, Cordaid, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and the NYU Center for Global Affairs for convening today's meeting on supporting durable peace in Afghanistan, and especially the role of Afghan women in the peace process. I also would like to recognize and acknowledge my fellow speakers, Ambassador Karen, also Teresa Whitfield in today's panel. As you know, that women in Afghanistan have been at the forefront of advocating for a peaceful settlement of the conflicts over the 10 years. Women have been leading actors, staging campaigns for peace. In early February 2019, peace talks took place in Moscow between the US government and also the Taliban that have advanced the possibility of the negotiated peace further than any previous attempt in 17-year-long conflict. However, women and agenda on women's rights was absent from the peace talks. The near total absence of women in the talks reminds us the harsh treatment of women in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule. Afghan women are concerned about the lack of transparency, and informal talks are going behind the closed doors. And for us, Afghan women, we are marginalized. This was the case with the United States was leading the peace talks, and now also with the recent developments of the Chinese government. It's a very dangerous example that should not be followed through. But we want a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. The role of women is extremely important. We saw the added value of women during the recent dialogues in Doha. It was us, the women of Afghanistan, who were putting important issues on the table. As opposed to men, we were not negotiating out of a position of self-interest, but the women were pushing the real issues, such as human rights, the red lines of the Constitution, and the need for an immediate ceasefire. Despite the ongoing efforts by the large group of dedicated women in Afghanistan, women's roles have been diminished and marginalized by the international stakeholders and as well as Afghan government in the peace processes, who are leveraging the Taliban's demands and discounting our calls to be on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarai. Ambassador, let me turn to you. You've been involved in Afghanistan for quite a long time, both, of course, being on the council and in previous incarnations. And I was hoping that you could explain how women's rights are in fact related to security, particularly in a context like Afghanistan, and why women's inclusion is so critical to the sustainability of the peace process.
Thank you very much, Jake, and nice to be here. And Rena and I worked together on one of those previous incarnations on Afghanistan. I think the generic case is probably very familiar to people in the room. The generic case is moral. It's their country too. It's economic. You can't actually build a truly prosperous society that enables any country to realize its potential if you exclude some 50% of the population from the economic and legal life of the country, never mind the social, but just if you're going to restrict access to the economy, that's going to retard any economy. And then I think there are some statistics around peace processes that you're probably familiar with. More than half collapse within the first 5 years if they don't have sustainable provisions, and those sustainable provisions have been shown in well-documented evidence to include gender provisions, women's provisions. I think there's something very special about women's education in this respect, and I worry that although immediately after 9/11, as the coalition and then NATO had some success on the ground, a very large number of girls were got in school, but I think we need to be careful that number doesn't plateau. And I see, at least when I was there, I was last there in 2016, there were some signs that we were not keeping the trajectory as steep as we would have liked to have done. I think, in all honesty, we have to be honest with ourselves. It's a very difficult argument to make to people like the Taliban, or some of the Taliban, that women should be brought into the peace process. But we have to make it. The fact that it's a hard argument isn't an argument for not making it. However, you do hear some people in governments, some people in the UN, some people in NGOs who say, no, we should go at the pace at which the Taliban want, because the cause of peace is so important, nothing should be allowed to deflect it. I don't want to say there isn't anything in that argument. I think it's very counterproductive when looking at peace processes to deal in absolutes. But I think we also know from what we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 6 years or so, maybe a bit more, that it is possible to bring women into the processes gradually. That may be not ideal, but it's certainly better than nothing. So I remember, maybe Rena, you do too, there was a lawyer jirga that Karzai held where the women were allowed to participate. And the first day they were allowed to sit there, and the second day they were allowed to take the record. But the third day they were allowed to actually join in. So I think there is something about getting the process right so that there isn't a shock to the system. You do it incrementally, you do it gradually, but above all, you do it steadily and you don't go backwards. And I think that's a very important ingredient.
Thanks, Ambassador. Both you and Starai, you talked about the importance of inclusion, both in the current process and previous processes. And Teresa, maybe to turn to you, I mean, thinking about the political process from a process standpoint, could you maybe say something about how you understand the inclusion of women to be unfolding in the current political process and how that compares to other examples?
Thanks, Jake. I think I'm a sort of word of caution, as it's quite difficult to tell how the current and future process will unveil at this moment. We're still waiting for the results of the election, and we still really don't know the fate of the kind of the US Taliban process, which took up a lot of space last year, but wasn't a full peace process, and obviously didn't include the Afghan government. And so issues of inclusion and exclusion were much broader, but extended to women, but were much broader than that. We still don't know what shape or form the process in Afghanistan will have, but we know a couple of things about it. It will be extremely complicated. It will involve issues regarding the withdrawal or not of US and NATO forces, conversations with the Taliban, needs to be properly rooted, Afghan-owned and led. It will involve complicated discussions with the region, and then a wider circle of consultations and a very engaged international community, given Afghanistan's past. It's going to be long. It's going to be very, very difficult. And I would also add that there is a particular onus and pressure on the issue of not just inclusion of women, but women's rights, given the particular history of Afghanistan. Normally in a peace process, it's relatively easy for parties to make forward-leaning promises about human rights. The past is always difficult, and the past will be very difficult in Afghanistan, but usually looking forward, all the parties can agree to improvement in human rights. In this case, because of the structural nature of the conflict and the identity of one of the parties, we all know there's the risk that rights may actually go backwards. Women's rights and human rights might actually go backwards, and that's a structurally unusual thing. I think without knowing exactly how the process will unfold, without knowing what kind of external, third-party, international, whatever facilitation might be, without knowing anything about the actors, there's still several things that we can look at in terms of the inclusion of women, and an awful lot of work to be done. And in this respect, it's great to be here today, and I know about the work of the Afghan Women's Network, and to know about the various streams that are work that are already ongoing, including from within the UN. So I'm going to make two broad points, and then just cite a couple of other processes where we've struggled with the issue of women's inclusion. And I think there's now quite a lot of knowledge and learning out there, which we can apply. Two broad points is an absolutely fundamental need for those of us who represent the international community and are on the outside of conflicts to put in the legwork, the analysis, the research, the knowledge, and always focus on harnessing internal forces, women within Afghan society, within civil society organizations, elsewhere, as well as the dynamics within the conflict parties and the constituencies they represent. The demand for inclusion, the demand for Afghan women's rights comes from Afghan women, and that's what needs to be represented in some shape or form at the table in the peace process. It's not an international thing. Those of us who represent organizations with norms and standards absolutely will be supporting that, but we need to be working in a way that it comes from inside and is owned from inside a society. The second point is a willingness and an openness to be creative and to recognize it's not going to be perfect. The Taliban is an organization which does not have women in positions of leadership, of political military leadership. When we have had women directly represented in negotiating delegations of conflict parties, I'm thinking back to examples like El Salvador, where there were women combatants and women commanders who were at the table. In Guatemala, one of the lead negotiators for the government was a woman. Philippines, the lead negotiator, Miriam Coronel Ferrer, now on our standby team, was a woman. People who were appointed by virtue of political and sometimes military power. We're not dealing with that. There are organizations which don't have women in political power. The Houthis is another good example. They don't have women who will be represented there. We can work towards it, but there are certain structural factors. So we need to be creative about a variety of different mechanisms to promote inclusion and the voices of many different women being heard. And there are a number of different models that we can do that broader, and also recognizing that a peace process in a conflict as long and complicated as Afghanistan will last some time. And there'll be different kind of formats. We've heard about the Lawyer Yergo format, the constitutional committees. There'll be a range of different formats and modalities, and it's important to be thinking about all of those different levels, not just thinking, oh, if there's a Lawyer Yergo, then women will be there, but thinking if there are negotiations between reserved parties, then even if women are not actually at the table representing the Taliban, how are we making sure that qualified women's voices are being heard and recognized and the perspectives of women being heard within those processes? We've learned, I'm not going to go into lots of details, but we've seen in different processes, there's models of advisory boards, pros and cons for many of them. We've seen the interesting evolution of the gender subcommittee in Colombia. At the beginning, a number of us thought it was just a sop to women, and it grew into something very useful. We've seen different processes where women experts, it's really important to be thinking about who are the women lawyers, who are the women experts in Sharia, who are the really qualified women who bring substantive contributions, who can be meeting with the parties and having their inputs at the table. We've seen the benefits of broader process of consultations. Going back to Guatemala, something like the Assembly of Civil Society had really concrete inputs. In Colombia, there was an online platform. There were consultations led by the UN and the National University, which brought a variety of perspectives. There was mechanisms set up to have victims, men and women, but obviously a lot of women in that context have their perspectives directly presented to the parties at the table. In Afghanistan, there's already, and this is a kind of new and emerging thing in the last few years for not just Afghanistan, elsewhere, but as social media is changing, where we spend a lot of time thinking about the destructive impact of social media and hate speech, all sorts of possibilities for inclusion and for information to be shared by creative use of social media already happening amongst some Afghan women. So these just as an indication of there are many, many different things to do, and this is a cause of some hope, but we need to be open to be engaging at a variety of different levels and be creative as the process moves forward.
Thanks, Teresa. That's actually a nice segue back to you, Sturai. So thinking about where we are now and where hopefully the peace process needs to come, what, in your view, needs to happen next, and how can the international community best support Afghan women, their rights, and their inclusivity in the peace process?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the international community for supporting Afghanistan since many years. I have some key recommendations, maybe requests on behalf of Afghan women to be considered in 2019 by the international community and also beyond that. My first recommendation is that although the peace negotiation between the Taliban and the US government have been stalled, but we, the women of Afghanistan, are very much committed, and we want the international community to restart the peace negotiations and also facilitate the intra-Afghan dialogue with a precondition for a ceasefire. Our second recommendation is as the peace process is a significant point in Afghanistan, so we want all the local, national, and also international stakeholders to remain very committed to women, peace, and security agenda in Afghanistan, and also support the women of Afghanistan to raise their voices in Afghanistan for their meaningful participation in the peacemaking, peace building, and also in the peace negotiations at the initial stages and also at the advisory roles within the peace table. Our third recommendation for the civil society will be that Afghan women still needs the support from the international community. This really does not mean that we want you to fight our battle, but it means we want you to create a space by the leverage that you have, like as donors and also as the policy makers. Our fourth recommendation is that do not give legitimacy and also leverage to the Taliban without balancing the playing field for the Afghan people, especially for women, because we really need that. There should be a balance between the international support while they are giving it to the Taliban and also to the Afghan women. For example, I exactly remember when the peace negotiation started in Doha, so we were struggling to donors to the international community to at least support 10 to 15 women to be at the table on Doha, but we also see that the smaller group like the Taliban, they are getting financial and also technical support from the international community. They're like going to Indonesia, they are going to Pakistan, to China, and they are just opening the peace negotiations. So that's really very much important for Afghan women. Our fifth recommendation is that we strongly support the Afghan Women Will Not Go Back campaign. And we also want the international community to strictly monitor and also observe the peace negotiation and also the peace process in Afghanistan. And we also want the international community to establish an information sharing system that can ensure the accountability and transparency of the peace negotiations and also peace process in Afghanistan. Our other request from the international community is to do not create the parallel structures. There are some international organizations in Afghanistan. They are working to establish new women coalitions or maybe some new networks rather than supporting the local initiatives like the Afghan Women's Network. Also, there are so many women mandated CSOs that they are working in Afghanistan since years. But it is good to invest on those institutions than creating a new one, because again we will be starting from the zero. So it is really very much important from the international community to integrate that in their plans for Afghanistan. My last my recommendation is, please do not forget the human rights, and therefore the women's rights should to be always a red line, because we are also afraid that the international community is no longer considering the red lines. So we really need the support of the international community, both also in terms of financial support, but more as a technical support as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sturai. You mentioned the point about red lines and the need to keep human rights and women's rights front and center. And Ambassador, turning back to you in your first set of remarks, you talked about this argument that's out there about essentially peace first, women second. And I wonder if maybe you could elaborate a bit further on that, given what Sturai was just saying about the need to ensure that human rights and women's rights are in fact a red line at a time when I think there's concern, there's concern that in a way this push for expediency by the United States, among others, to try and broker a deal that will enable the withdrawal of troops will come at the expense of a more comprehensive political process that includes a broad swath of Afghan society and addresses some of these issues, if you could.
Thanks very much. I think these are obviously difficult questions because a lot does depend on circumstance. I think you need to be, I completely agree that a final agreement must have protection of women, protection of sexual and reproductive rights in it, and must actually have some very robust clauses about human rights commitments, both domestic and international. I don't know that with an organization as unstructured as the Taliban that you necessarily go into a negotiation setting out red lines. I think it's right that we have them. It's right that we all know what they are ourselves, and it's right that we have a plan for delivering them. But I used to think differently about this, and then I had a really interesting conversation with Jonathan Powell, who some of you may know was instrumental in getting the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement. And he said to me, quite frankly, I think you're doing this the wrong way round. The point at which you ask for the things you really need are at the end when peace is in sight. They're not right at the beginning. And I said, well, look, I'm trying to create the context. I'm trying to create a framework. I'm trying to make it very clear that some things can't be dropped. And he just gave me a different perspective. And I think you just have to be a skilled enough negotiator and have your own team agree on what your tactics are and what you want to see in the end, to know which of those two approaches is actually going to be productive in each case. So I'm not talking about the outcome. As I said and Jake alluded to, there is a minimum level of human rights and women's rights that's needed for peace agreements to thrive. I would, though, if I may say a bit about peace and justice. This is a perennial debate, as we all know. It goes on in the Security Council. Always there's a view to put peace above justice. We really need to tackle that because it's something we don't really talk about. And as I say, governments are guilty of this, NGOs are guilty of it, parts of the UN are guilty of it. It's a different way of looking at the world. But I think most of the time when we sacrifice the longer term goal to short term expediency, we end up within a reasonably short space of time wishing we hadn't. It's a hard thing to deal with. And I think you do need actually to have a comprehensive peace agreement as opposed to a siloed peace agreement. Now, I haven't talked to Ambassador Khalilzad, so I don't want to criticize his approach because I'm not privy to his line of argument or his line of approach. But I think it is true to say that if you have a comprehensive agreement, you can find compensations in different bits of that agreement for things that people are having to give up at a certain point. And this is proving true on Yemen, I think, where Martin Griffiths is trying to unpack the agreement so that the Houthis may not get what they want on Hodeidah, but they might find that it helps them in terms of the future representation in the government of Yemen. So I think this is also true of women's rights.
Thanks, Ambassador. Teresa, one of the issues around the peace process that has come up is the potential for fragmentation among the Taliban and questions about its cohesiveness, whether in fact there are strong command and control structures between local fighters on the ground and those negotiating in Doha. And I wonder, I mean, thinking about the Afghanistan process, are there particular lessons from other places about how to potentially manage spoilers?
Thank you. Drawing on another lesson from Northern Ireland, Gerry Adams once said, and I think it holds true of almost everywhere, that the hardest negotiations are with your own side. But I would also say there's quite a long history of, at least during negotiations, the actual armed, non-state armed group, which tend to be hierarchical, military. Sometimes I'm thinking of the FARC in Colombia, kind of authoritarian and Stalinist, and sometimes in their internal structures, are generally easier to hold together than a government side. And when in the summer there was some thinking and it looked as if the US-Taliban agreement was going to come together and then there was going to be a shift towards an inter-Afghan process, there was, and looking at how complicated governance in Afghanistan is, I think there were certainly, and looking forward, one could see as well, and I have no clue, many in this room will know better than I do, or have a better sense of where the Afghan political process after the elections may go. But you can also see that challenges in holding together through a peace process will apply equally, if not more so, to the government side or to the Afghan Republic side in terms of how broad will inclusion be of what forces on an Afghan side. So just to say those concerns are there for the Taliban, but they're really there on whatever the other side might be, the Afghan side. And certainly it will be in a country as complicated and fragmented as Afghanistan. That's why I say it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to require a series of conversations at different kind of levels. And questions of inclusion are going to be key. And there's going to be a big question, I think, and it relates very centrally to the role of women and to the future of the entire generation of Afghans who've been born since 9/11. For me, there's a really big sort of existential question about whether it's possible to have a peace process in Afghanistan that looks towards a new Afghanistan and isn't just a stitching up of deals amongst some of the warlords on both sides who are still there, who will be looking to stitch up deals on the sideline of the kind of comprehensive agreement that Ambassador Pierce is talking about. So I think we need to be very conscious of these big questions. And actually, the first concern would not be, is the Taliban going to hold together? It's going to be what's going to be what will be on the other side and how that will work, and what are the forces that might will those with a vision and a sense of the future of Afghanistan be able to prevail. And there is an extraordinary generation of younger Afghans who's emerged, political leaders as well, in this last period. Will it be that Afghanistan that comes through, or will we end up going back to the kind of Bonn and a kind of stitching up deals with a lot of those pretty unsavory characters who are still around from the past? So I think those are really, really big questions.
All right, we're going to open the floor up for question and answers. Before we do, I'm going to give sort of first right of response to Mahbouba Siraj, who is the representative of a very prominent Afghan women's organization who we're very lucky to have with us. So Mahbouba, please. And great. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Up front.
Thank you very much. First of all, seeing everybody, thank you, the panel. I mean, you were absolutely wonderful. And seeing everybody and their faces in this meeting kind of makes me hopeful that, you know, the world still cares for Afghanistan, because sometimes we think that nobody really does. And I'm really happy to see that. Thank you so much. You've always been such a support and powerhouse behind us, next to us all the time. And we will need it a lot more from here on, believe me. Because of what we are going to be going through in Afghanistan, as all of the distinguished panelists said, is not going to be easy, as you mentioned. It's not a very easy thing to do. But at the same time, I do believe there are a few things we can do, or the world can do. And one of those things that the world can do, the world actually can stand behind the stance that they're going to be taking towards Afghanistan. Don't worry about the fact that how the Taliban are going to react, or how President Trump feels one day to the next. Worry about the fact that how you feel about the whole thing as the world. How do you feel? Do you feel that you really need to stand behind this country? And do you really feel that you really need to take a stance and really say, this is what we are going to be doing from here onwards? Because if you don't do that, and if you stay on a basis of being a little bit wishy-washy with the Taliban are going to take advantage of it, which they actually did during the talks. I mean, the Taliban were so pumped up for a while when the talks went on first, you know, as far as the peace deal that the United States was supposed to be making with them, that talking to the Taliban became completely impossible. They thought they are the winners. They thought they are the ones that they have done everything. They thought that they can just, you know, run with whatever, and they were giving ultimatums to the world. So, I mean, don't forget, that's the kind of men that you have to deal with. And I think by now you really know them, so the world knows them. And giving them that kind of a power is not a good thing, because we really lost it. We really had no idea what to do in Afghanistan. And we were kind of seeing that the concessions after concessions after concessions were being given to the Taliban, and Taliban were not giving anything. So if you do give so much to a bunch of people which are the opposite of you, and you're supposed to be making a deal with, why should they? I mean, the world was like kind of throwing this red carpet in front of them and say, you walk all over it, walk all over the Afghan women, walk all over the human rights, walk all over on anything you want. Do whatever you want. We are here. That's not the way that this peace is going to work, definitely. Because at the end of the day, we have to live with them. And when we have to live with them, that means all of these people, they have to live with them. The young girls that they have come from Afghanistan, what they're going to do? They're going to be a refugee, again, like my generation was all over the world, or we are going to have Afghanistan to live in and make it a country that it needs to be. So your promise on this, your attention on this, and especially you, Madam Ambassador, I heard you yesterday at the Security Council as well. And I really appreciated what you said. And thank you. We do need, and yours as well, you have a fantastic, eye for the whole, how shall I say, analyzing this whole thing. But please, let's not forget the human part of it, because that is so important. And if we kind of forget about the human side of it, then what's the point of having a peace or not a peace? Who cares? Thank you so much.
All right, so if you could raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone around, and I'd ask two things. If you could introduce yourself, and please keep your comments or questions brief. Thank you. Yeah.
Shazia Rafi with Global Parliamentary Services, former Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. So I have two questions, one for Ambassador Pierce and one for Ms. Tapesh. For Ambassador Pierce, Afghanistan since 2003 has been a state party of the International Criminal Court. So to some extent, and they have followed that up with new criminal code legislation in 2017, incorporating 4 of the crimes into their domestic code. So we may not need to reinvent the red line. The red line already exists because the crimes against humanity committed by the Taliban and others in that country are part of what the international community in Afghanistan has already agreed to prosecute. So to some extent, I'd be interested in knowing, from the point of view of the Security Council, your country and France are also states parties of the ICC. The US is not, so perhaps their negotiations with the Taliban are a different situation. But, as state parties to a law that now exists both within Afghanistan and at the international level, how would negotiations with people who have committed those crimes or may have committed them since May 2003, when it becomes under force in Afghanistan, plays out? To Ms. Tapesh, I'd be interested in knowing how the women who were elected into the Afghan parliament I know some of their struggles to get leadership and authority within the legislature, but going forward, now there has been some experience of working within the political process. How can they play a role in the future on negotiations, including those who are more of the conservative parties, so that they may be able to have more inroads with the Taliban, just like the Jamaat-e-Islami or the JUI has across the other end of the Durand line? Thank you.
And then one right behind.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Martina Bale from UN Human Rights, and thank you so much for your interventions. I really appreciate the fact that in the Security Council, human rights is high on the agenda, especially in Afghanistan. And I think it's important that we recall also the Secretary General's words when he said that there is no comprehensive peace without human rights. So thank you so much. Also, thank you for Madam Tapesh's intervention on what's actually being done on the ground. I think it's very useful also for our work. So I'm working in the Peace Mission Support Section here at UN Human Rights. I'm the mission focal point for UNAMA, for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. And my question would be, maybe from your perspective, what should the mission do, or what could the mission do even better in supporting your efforts on the ground in protecting and promoting human rights for women in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Seeing, all right, in the back, please.
Thank you for this. My name is Faraz. I'm from UN OCT. My question is to Ms. Tapesh. What's the biggest challenge of the Afghan woman under the Taliban regime? I mean, according to her, what is the biggest thing, the biggest challenge for the Afghan woman? Thank you.
All right, great. Why don't we'll come, I see one more hand. Okay, we'll take that and then we'll come back to the panel. Microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Kezienwa. I work with the Women's International Peace Center based in Kampala. My question is for Ms. Pierce. You're the UK ambassador, right? Okay, thank you for yesterday, for the statement. What are we going to do about these donors who support the Taliban? And even give them more support than they give to the government? What should we do about donors who do not take into account the fact that women need to be at the table? So 19 years, we are on 1325. The Afghan peace process has been on forever, and we seem to be, we take 2 steps forward and 20 steps backward. Is there something we can do in terms of putting some sanctions, for people who are supporting arms and supporting, opposition leaders? I mean, there's something, I think we need to do more than what we're doing already. So I see some kind of rhetorics with all this. I see some kind of people benefiting from these conflicts, and we have not come to a point where we should name and shame them or do more to hold them accountable to their actions. Because as it is, and with all the conversations we've been having around here at the UN, women continue to bear the brunt of the conflict. Women continue to be raped. And just hear what she's talked about, the fact that women are being locked out. Why should we keep asking for the doors to be opened for women at this stage, that we are? I want to hear from you, what can we do practically, and urgently, to put an end to the situation in Afghanistan, but also in other conflict-ridden countries. Thank you.
All right, great. We'll come back to our speakers. Storai, why don't I start with you? We'll go in the order of speaking.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I would like to thank Shazia for raising that question, that how the women from the parliament can play a role. In my opinion, the women who are at the parliament, they can play a very vital and great role, especially in the peace process of Afghanistan. And we, in Afghan Women's Network, we already have the women MP as our allies. So they are part of our coalition. We have consultation meetings together, and we are sharing our inputs, and we are also working to establish a common agenda in Afghanistan. And the MPs specifically, they can work like at the subnational level. They can mobilize more women and also youth together. And at the same time, they can also be part of the lobby meetings with the government of Afghanistan, and also they can be part of the peace negotiation. As we also saw that there was a list of those who were about to be part of the Doha meeting. So we also saw some of the women who were selected from the parliament, like Ms. Shinkai Kaurikhil, Fawzia Kufi, they all were there. So before they were going to the meeting, so we had a meeting in Kabul as well. We had our position paper, we shared our views, our insights, so those all voices were consolidated, and we shared the statement with them so they can raise our voices on behalf of Afghan people. And I also have 2 colleagues from Afghanistan here, Ustaz Siraj and also Ms. Nasima Umari, she can add upon. Yeah.
On the women in parliament, actually, the group of the young women in parliament, they really do have a much bigger role, because at this time in the parliament of Afghanistan, there is a group of a lot of young women that entered the parliament. And we are really hopeful for them to be involved, a lot more in the peace talks in the future. So that is something that I believe Storai has another meeting tomorrow that she will be talking about this subject of the involvement of the young population of Afghanistan. Because I don't know if any one of you really know it or not, but about 68% of the population in Afghanistan, they're all young people. So they are a force to be, to be reckoned with. They can be extremely positive to have. At the same time, they can be extremely dangerous if we are not really careful as far as giving them jobs are concerned or looking after them. But that is the way in the parliament. The young women are actually having a much bigger role now for the young generation of Afghanistan, mostly.
Thanks, Mahbooba. Ambassador, there were a number of questions that were directed at you, so let me turn to you now.
Right, well, if I miss one out or I haven't understood the question, just feel free to interrupt. I think the point about ICC, I mean, yes, you're right. As a result of an initiative the British government started in 2013, 2014, I think rape in war is now considered as a grave breach, as one of the grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. But we also had those systems in Britain at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. So the fact that Afghanistan has recourse to the ICC is good. It means the prospect of prosecution is real, but it doesn't alter the equation that at the point of almost getting a peace agreement, some people get impunity. And you can argue about that. We can all lament it, but it is probably the thing that in the end cements the peace deal. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying that if you look at these peace deals that bring an end to nationwide fighting, then you usually find that somewhere in the system there will be impunity for some people. Now, I worked a lot on the Balkans, and in 1999, the South African government offered Milosevic a safe haven to save him being prosecuted by the criminal tribunal. He had not been indicted at that time. And we and a couple of other governments opposed that. But a number of people, even in our own system, said, well, hang on a minute, you'll get him out of the Balkans. And then both Bosnia and Kosovo can go back to being normal countries. In the end, we didn't let the South Africans pursue that. He was indicted, and that began the beginning of his end, all good. But we can all think of examples where that actually wasn't the story. It took a very long time for President Bashir in Sudan actually to come to the end of his reign, if you like. So again, these things are not linear, and they very much depend on the context. So yes, it's good that Afghanistan has these means of getting justice for the people who've been harmed by the Taliban, but I don't think it changes the fundamentals of a peace process and how you go about that. On the lady who asked about donors and the Taliban and what more can we do, I think the first thing is to keep up the pressure each and every day for women to be included in the peace process. That's one thing. The executive director of UN Women said the UN's own record wasn't great in this respect, and sadly I have to agree with her. When I was in Geneva, we had the then Syria peace process. It was Brahimi who kept the Syrian women out. And that leads me to another point. I think the women have to be very coordinated themselves. Often what you see is a lot of, you see it in all groups coming to a peace process. You see a lot of good intentions, but it's what Teresa was saying about coordinating your own side. Often the group involved might not be single-minded enough or have a coherent enough agenda. So I would say we on our side have to keep up the pressure, including the UN and others. The women's groups themselves have to be very well coordinated among themselves, and also to know what their hierarchy of priorities are in any given moment, because it's very easy to pick people off if they're not clear about what they really want. I think we can do more to call out donors who don't uphold the UN Charter, to put it at its broadest, and we can all think of who those are. But again, we need the UN agencies. They don't have to do it publicly, but the UN agencies should also work behind the scenes to try and change those donors' minds. We on the council can do it publicly. We've tried to do that on Syria, for example, but yes, there's more to do. But practically, I think we can also probably try and put more money into these things and perhaps lend these groups experienced negotiators, mediators, trainers who can help them have the skills they need so that they can compete at the negotiating table. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I realized there was another question for Sarai that we skipped over, so let me come back to you and then we'll turn to you, Teresa.
Yeah, actually, there was another question for me that what was the worst thing about the Taliban for women? So the worst thing for us was like women were not allowed to attend at the negotiation table, and like the negotiation table was extremely lacking women's voice. However, I told in the beginning that there was lack of the information sharing system. We really didn't know that what was the negotiation about. Like when we had some meeting with Zalmay Khalilzad in Kabul, and then he listed that that we talked about like in counter-terrorism. They talked about the withdrawal of the U.S. troops. They talked about the ceasefire at the last, but they never talked about women agenda. That what could be like the Taliban view regarding women's rights. But of course, like there were some rumors, and after the peace negotiation, like the Taliban delegation, they had some interviews with the BBCs and also with the CNN and other media channels, and they say that women are not allowed to work in the media, and that was like they really didn't want it to women to work at the media, to appear in the TVs and to take the interviews. And the other was like they wanted the interim government in Afghanistan, but those were all like the rumors, like the very informal interviews, but there was nothing formal think about the women of Afghanistan, that what they really want from the women of Afghanistan. But for me, as a young woman, the worst thing was that we were not able to sit at the negotiation table, to be included in the peace talks, and especially women are so much marginalized, and they are not involved while they are doing the agenda setting, while they are doing the initial peace communications. They are only invited in the 11th hour, and then they just send out the invitations and they select the women themselves, that A, B, C, D. These women will go from the civil society, also on behalf of the High Peace Council. So that is why we really don't know about what happened in the 8th round of the negotiations. But in the 8th round of the peace negotiation, there was like around 10 women when they came back to Afghanistan, and then when we asked them that what was actually the negotiation about, then they say that it was just a preparatory and introductory meeting. So that is why we really don't know that what's happening at the peace table, and that is why we are raising our voice, and we want the international community to support us and also to observe and monitor the peace process, that we also really know that what's happening and what's not happening. Thank you.
Teresa, let me turn to you.
Thanks. Just a couple of points. And building on what Karen was saying earlier, I think one of the things you have to remember about a negotiation is it is a negotiation and parties' positions change. One of the jobs of a facilitator or mediation support team is to help, in a way, is to kind of provide a bit of imagination and provide the open up minds to possibilities and options that parties might not have imagined. You don't reach a peace agreement. If parties could see the peace agreement they're going to sign at the end, they would probably turn around and run away, because the differences, and Afghanistan's no exception, the differences are so broad at the beginning that it can look as if it's impossible. But if the will and the push and the pressure and the desire to reach peace is more than anything else, then a considerable amount of change is possible, and indeed that's necessary. What that also means is that peace agreements tend to be kind of rather unpleasant, unseemly affairs with some kind of murky compromises in there as well. In terms of what can be done, I think and speaking from a UN perspective, it is important for bodies and states and actors which have their own commitments to norms and principles to make those very clear and stick by them. It's different than expecting the Taliban to, have respect for women's rights as the first on its agenda. I agree, you're going to get there down the line. But the UN, for example, has clear guidelines on not accepting impunity for those three big categories of ICC-related crimes, and that's something we stand for. We stand for human rights, we stand for women's rights. All of these things are very clear. And the UN, as other actors which have these principles as core to their foreign policies, will need to go into the processes like that. And the fact that Afghanistan is a country which is so dependent on international assistance means there's actually quite a lot of leverage during the course of the peace process, and certainly an implementation and looking forward to economic assistance in the future. But it also means we need to pay attention internally, walk the talk. And there are too many cases. I've been in meetings where you have all male delegations of a particular Western country lining up and telling everybody that they need to respect women's rights, and you're from a Northern European country and there is no woman in sight. In UN, there are not as many women mediators as I would like. We're doing much better than we were in terms of SRSGs, DSRSGs, and all our mediation teams have women within them. But we also need to be constantly paying attention to this. And it's really important that those who have meetings with the Taliban have senior women with them. If women leading delegations, fine. That UNAMA has done a great job of some really extraordinary leaders of the human rights division within UNAMA who've been women, who've been meeting with the Taliban for years and who've had very tough conversations over the years and been treated with respect as capable professionals. And that kind of thing is really important. We need to be, as I said earlier, thinking about expert advisory bodies, which include expert qualified women from Afghanistan who are providing expertise and normalizing the sense that women are substantive and have substantive offerings and contributions to make to the process, not just there are two women sitting at the table and job done, but what are women contributing in terms of their substantive expertise. We need to be encouraging broad consultations in country and making sure that these consultations are inclusive as possible of women, but other communities as well, whose voices need to be heard in the process. And then there may be, one can imagine circumstances in which there's a complicated process going on, and then you can have independent efforts drawing attention, a kind of advocacy efforts outside, drawing attention to women's rights and needs in other forums that can be putting pressure on the process. And as I said before, thinking creatively about social media and different kinds of mechanisms to get the perspectives and voices of women into whatever the process may be. Thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. We have about 15 minutes for additional questions. I see two right here, Anne-Marie, and then just behind, and then in the back.
Thank you. Should I go ahead? Anne-Marie Gutz from New York University. I was wondering what the panel thinks about the damage that's been done in the past year by the Doha talks with the Taliban and also the Yemen negotiations, the Hodeidah, by excluding women. We've, in the Women, Peace and Security community, we observe quite a lot a sort of anticipatory concession making to certain parties to talks where it's assumed that they would not tolerate women or gender equality concerns. And so this inadequate efforts are made right from the start. I don't think that was the case in Yemen. But we heard yesterday that Afghan women were told that the Taliban had refused to have women present, and that subsequent examination found that they had never said that. They said women could come to the negotiations if they were properly covered, maybe not on their side, but on the other side. So I'm wondering about the potential damage, because what happened in the case of the Taliban talks has greatly emboldened, I would imagine, spoilers who can see that the more damage you do, the more difficult you are, the more eager the international community is to come and negotiate. And the fact that we have all, as Rena said, there's this informal surrendering to this idea that we're going to sacrifice women's rights, that has clearly, that's a message that's been heard loud and clear. So I wonder if you can think about, talk about the damage, and also bearing in mind what the SG's report on women, peace, and security said, which is that in 2018 we've seen significant backsliding on efforts to involve women in peace talks and to have gender content in the actual accords.
This was not pre-planned. I'm Vera Jelinek, and I'm from the Center for Global Affairs at NYU. And Anne-Marie and I do work together and have done so for many years. My question is a general one to any one of you that wants to answer, but you've talked a lot about young people. You've also talked about people who have been born after 2001, but you've only talked about that in the context of women and girls. And I'd like to find out whether there are any possibilities of drawing young men into the process and work. And I know this is going to be a very difficult step, but I think without that, it's not going to be very successful. And I think they can be co-opted down the line. And we're talking about the future and processes and steps. So I'd like to hear your comments about that. Who's next?
And then I've got two more questions, one in the back and one here.
Thanks very much. My name is Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. My question goes to Story. This is about your contacts with the US Congress. Have you been in touch with them? What has been their response? And are you satisfied with the response you got? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danieli. I will speak from my hat as the director of the International Center of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, because I too was very taken by the long-term view that both you took and the issue of sustainability a long time. And you always ask the question I was going to ask before. And indeed, you mentioned 68% of youth. Not only do I totally agree that men have to partake in the commitment, but has there been a change in the young people as compared to your generation, for example, in the understanding of more equality, equal education? Have you seen a change in the populace, not just in the people who are going to sign the agreement?
Thanks, Gail. Okay, we're going to come back to the speakers then. Stura, if I could invite you to respond first.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, actually about the question about the Congress, yes, the Afghan Women's Network, we worked a lot in the peace process. And while the peace negotiation started, and we already saw that there are so many obstacles for women, so that is why we mobilized women from all walks of life, starting from the minister on their own personal capacity and ending it to civil servants. We mobilized all women, and we also had an open letter to the Congress. And then also we sent a delegation to the DC, and they raised our voices in the Congress. They had several meetings. And upon those lobby meetings, they enacted the WIN Act for Afghan women that clearly defines that women to be included in the peace negotiation and also in the peace table. So I also have those delegates here in the room. So I would like to ask Ms. Mahbouba Siraj to give some more information about TWN position and also Afghan women's position in the Congress, because she was one of those delegates who was present there.
Thank you very much. When the whole talks with the Taliban started, as you all know, the women of Afghanistan were completely absent. Not only the women of Afghanistan were absent, everybody was absent. So the only ones that were there was really the United States and Khalilzad and his group that they were doing the talks. When we realized what was going on, the Afghan Women Network, with the help of Cordaid and with the help of some of the other embassies in Afghanistan, we all actually got together and we decided we wanted to go to Doha, actually a bunch of us. We wanted to go to Doha to take place, at the table and talk with the Taliban, which unfortunately that never happened. But because a lot of things happened, it was very, very strange the way the whole game was played. There were actually visas given to some of us, but then from the government of Qatar, we were told some of the women cannot come to this meeting. So it was like very strange. But anyway, so we couldn't go there. So we decided to come here to the United States and go and knock on the doors of the Hill in Congress and see if they can help. And we actually got their attention. And that was really the win number one for the women of Afghanistan. And that was the one that we actually, from then onwards, we realized, because we changed the whole, how shall I say, trajectory of the peace process. Of this whole talks, it changed. And after that, it was realized that the women have to be there, civil society has to be there, the young people have to be there. So the intra-government, the intra-Afghan talks started to get a momentum. So it was all because of that, because we went there. And because of, so the realization is that's why it's so important for us. That's why when we come and talk to you all and we say stand behind us, is exactly because of that. Because we know what we can do and we know what will be the difference. If we are all really are standing together and if we are supporting each other, and especially, standing and the countries that they are helping, if they have a clear agenda on what are the things, as you said, Ms. Whitefield, what are the things that is allowed, what are the things that is not allowed. If that is clear, then the rest of it will go accordingly. I can promise you that, because it's really human psychology is very interesting. You give them more, you think that you can give them anything they ask, they will ask for more. You give them more and they'll ask for more. But if you draw the line and you say, this is how much I'm going to do, and that's how much you're going to do, then the whole thing changes. So that's the thing. And as far as the young people are concerned, bringing the boys, the men, actually, the men on the talks, it's been very important, and we really like them to be. But right now, we are really talking about actually the women of Afghanistan, because our needs are very different. And somebody asked a question regarding you did whether there has been a change, with the new generation and the older generation. Definitely a huge change. You will not believe what these what our young people, where they're going, where their head is now, what they are interested in. There's not really much difference between a young Afghan boy or a girl than a young, European boy or a girl, or another Asian country. They are all into the media, the social media. They're all into clothing. They're all into design. They're all into their sports. The women of Afghanistan, they have this bicycling teams that they are doing that, and they have all sorts of things that they are involved in. They have groups that they have formed. They have meetings. They go and see each other. They gather money. They help on the causes that they believe. They are very, very different. It's not the same group of people at all, actually.
Thank you, Mahbouba. Ambassador Pierce, let me turn to you.
Thanks for your...
Sorry.
Hello all, I'm Nasima Mari. I just want to add or build on the points that Mahbouba Sarraj said. Youth has a huger impact on the society, and there was huge change compared to last year's or past years. We can see nowadays youths are taking part in politics, and also they are taking part in peace process. You have heard the march that they made all over to come to the Kabul and ask for peace and ceasefire. And also we have very talented youth that are part of HPC, High Peace Council. And if we have a peace ministry, obviously we will be lobbying for quality involvement of youth in the peace process. But this is also a big challenge for us, because the peace agreement is a political document, and it's like bringing two parties together. We have huge potential in both sides. So we need to be very much careful in drafting these documents, and also thinking about the development, because now you're moving toward geo-development if we have that peace agreement in place. So we need to take into consideration of youth in both parties, like youth in Taliban and also youth in civilian side. So this is quite important. I need attention of civil societies and international stakeholders on youth, investment on the youth to be very much crucial and important at this moment. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Ambassador Pierce, please.
Thanks very much. Well, I very much agree with what the last two speakers said. To answer Anne-Marie's question, I think it's never a good idea as a matter of negotiation to be preemptive. And preemptive cringing is worse than anything. So, don't offer something unless the other side actually asks for it, and then get a price for it. But it is striking how many Western delegations start from the point of view of offering stuff up front that they should not be offering. So I think there's a generic point there. I think in terms of what is the effect, it obviously means you might just get on a track. It's then very hard to get off. So it's dangerous as well, because it reduces your options for getting into the final deal, what you might want to get into it. But I think there is something that can be done about that, and it goes back to our speaker from Uganda, and I was just thinking about it as you were talking. I think there's something very important in Afghanistan about the government going faster. I think the government has actually, against all the odds, done a pretty good job of trying to get legislation in place and trying to get the right frameworks. So this is not a criticism of the government. But if I looked at the prospect of more peace talks with the Taliban, I would be accelerating the legislative framework as fast as I possibly could. Even if it is then imperfectly implemented round the country. Because once you've got that framework, it's actually very hard to have it overturned in a settlement scenario. And I would be putting a lot of effort into establishing the courts on a sounder footing, and a lot of effort into what Mrs. Ghani works on, which is trying to get teachers and midwives in the provinces. I think that's one answer to the question about young men. Yes, you're right. They obviously are an integral part of any solution. But I think the main solution to the problem of young unemployed boys and men is actually to get the economy working. Because then it kind of takes over and they don't have time to go off and be seduced by the Taliban or ISIS or loiter on the streets. So I would put even more effort into getting the Afghan economy moving. And I may well be out of date, but from when I was there, from memory, more probably could be done, again, on legislation to free up things like private ownership, get in competition, reduce the number of entities that the government owns in favour of private competition. And saying that not meaning to prejudice what sort of economy Afghanistan has, but it's striking that all the Afghan businessmen would fly in on their private jets from Dubai and the government ministries wouldn't see them. So there's something about getting the economy going that's very relevant to this. Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador. Teresa.
Very briefly, I know we're out of time, but just to echo the point about men and recognising that women's rights are about human rights as well, and that if one's thinking about and the need to capture what's changed in Afghan society and therefore work with the younger generation of men who need to support women's rights and who are looking. They have wives, they have daughters, they're part of a society which is evolving really quickly, and it's the preservation and forward direction of that society that's at stake. It isn't just about whether women are included in a peace process. It's that a process which delivers an inclusive and peaceful and sustainably peaceful society. And it's because we're working towards that kind of inclusive society that we mind about the inclusion of women in a peace process. And so just holding on, if we hold on to that big goal, then obviously men, and critically young men, have a very important part to play in that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we're at the end of time. I think to quickly sum up, if there's a sort of meta theme to this, it's about the tension between, on one hand, principles and on the other, pragmatism. But I think listening to the three panelists, there are a number of themes that came up that I think are worth reiterating. First is the need for the UN, but also member states, the international community more broadly, to stand by principles, including the principles of the UN Charter, and to be consistent both internally and externally. Second, Ambassador Pierce, as you said, the need for gradual, steady forward progress in terms of inclusion. The point about the importance of harnessing not just women's participation, but women's substantive expertise in processes, and the need to be creative about how we actually do this, how we ensure that women are included in processes, and recognizing that it won't be perfect, but that there are, in fact, opportunities to use multiple processes to ensure that we get as close to perfect as we can be. Fifth, I think a very strong call for as much transparency as possible around processes, something that Storai, you raised quite a number of times. And maybe to end, I like this point, Ambassador, that you raised talking about the Good Friday agreements, which again gets back to principles versus pragmatism, but the idea of asking for what you really need when peace is in sight, because I think ultimately the aim is a comprehensive agreement, and there are different paths to get there, but we need to try multiple fronts in order to do that and to ensure that women's inclusion is meaningful in that. So with that, please join me in thanking our speakers.